Thank you for coming here, and I'm very happy, eager, excited, a little intimidated to be in conversation with you. Um, a lot of my friends said, "Oh, he just destroys the people who interview him."
Hardly. Hardly.
so, so yeah, it's taken all this extra courage to come and actually pose questions to you. So you just come back from Delhi, where in Jantar Mantar there was this massive protest by Kerala's Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan on the southern states and the tax. And I remember very clearly, like last year, the same festival. You were speaking on fiscal federalism with Shashi Tharoor, and you were making this huge point about, the imbalance in taxation and all of this. So, where do you see the future? Um,
It's very troubling. The imbalance as it is today is bad enough. States in the south are huge net contributors to the overall exchequer. But I think the politicization of finance or finances and the inability to achieve any sort of return on the invested money or the redistributed money, I think are the two really difficult or troubling things. One, unlike any other government in the history of India, this Prime Minister's government is using money as an aggressive tool against its political opponents. Second, after all of that money is redistributed, I think you saw this year's budget, the total allocation to UP is something like 14% higher than the allocation to all the 5 southern states together. After all of that, UP is growing on a per capita basis 2% lower than Tamil Nadu on average CAGR of the last 5 years. So all this money, and if I go back 20, 30 years, you take states like Bihar, this is true, that no matter how much money you put into these states, you're not able to bring either the standard of living or the trajectory of GDP growth in any kind of synchronization or compatibility. So these are very troubling because it's a one-way path to a very really unpalatable outcome. At some point, as I've said to the 15th Finance Commission back 6 or 7 years ago, whenever it was 2018, so 6 years ago, I said, at what point do people in the net donor states start asking, what's in it for me? I keep on giving more and more, you keep on giving me less and less, and nothing changes. The poor stay poor. How long does this continue? So I think that's the danger for me.
a couple of days ago, I think the Prime Minister actually accused the Congress of bringing this North-South question and, politicizing it. Do you think there's an aspect of them, I mean, like people getting triggered? Because when you talk about the North-South, whatever, it kind of brings back imagery of what Periyar stood for, what Anna stood for, what the Justice Party stood for, but also in so many ways what even Ambedkar kind of hinted at, isn't it? The North and the South are like, fundamentally or culturally different and all of this. Do you think that is people are taking it as an emotive issue rather than just an issue of finances?
I think I'll separate that into two different questions.
Mm-hmm.
At the political level, I would say this Prime Minister, who has been on the cover of Time magazine as the divider in chief, is the last person to talk about dividing anything. He's the person who, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, was the biggest vocal, strident critic of the union government and its devolution policies. Even day before yesterday, I retweeted a tweet where he had been, as Chief Minister of Gujarat, he had said, we have paid in 60,000 crores. Whose money do you think you're giving us back? Are we beggars? So if there's a question of anybody to say about divisive or whether states should have some accounting or whether we should all see it as, some general money, I think the Prime Minister is the least qualified person based on his track record to speak about these things. Of course, he is the ultimate politician. So every statement is politics and every statement is memoryless. He can say black today and white tomorrow and find it internally inconsistent with himself. So I won't progress further down what he said. it's not worth that kind of debate. But if you go to a more profound question, that I think is worth looking at in the historical context. If you look back even to the Constituent Assembly and back in the days of Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar, there was significant discussion about whether it's possible to create a confederation, which is, the union of states, of such disparate states in any kind of cohesive way, and whether instead there should have been the notion of two different confederations, a confederation of southern states, a confederation of northern states, and then some kind of super confederation on top of that. These were all discussed in the days of the Constituent Assembly. So I think if that was the case back in the 1940s, or those thereabouts, the only thing I would point out is that at the inception of the country as a political entity, as a republic, there was not that much separating the best and the worst state in any dimension. If then itself they felt the need to consider the notion of two confederations, then today we have a completely different situation. On average in the south, the per capita income is higher, the fertility rate is lower, the education levels are much higher, the human development index is much higher, the social development is much higher, the inclusion of women is much higher. On almost any dimension you take, we have much more disparate outcomes today than we did when we were in 1940. So then the question arises, is it really the focus on, unity in diversity, and so we can have greater devolution of decision making and power and finances, and find a way to coexist and cohesively work together where we can formulate local policy relative to local needs? Or if you insist on going down a one nation, one X, one nation, one language, one nation, one food, one nation, one tax, one nation, one clothing, one nation, whatever, at some point you're going to run into the reality that really these are two completely disparate living conditions today. And how much of one nation can you impose on people with such disparate conditions?
I actually want to pick on that because one of the things is, and this I constantly see toward in most of your speeches or whatever you publish, is that you reject this one size fits all approach. So if and saying that there's no magic, solution to all of this. So how do you think that the, let's say, the so-called Hindi belt would develop, or what would be the way forward for them, and what would be the way forward for somebody, let's say, like Tamil Nadu or some state like Kerala, like if they have to have both growth but also sustainable growth?
Well, I mean, let's look at a very concrete problem, right? All of us have, in varying stages, a demographic dividend that's about to run out. In Kerala and Tamil Nadu, it's probably on its last legs. In the heart of the Hindi belt, let's take UP and Bihar as exemplary of that. It's probably got one generation left to run, where the fertility rate is still going to be high enough that they're getting more young people. For example, just to put that in global context, I think India is still seeing something like 10 to 15 additional citizens per year in its total population, net of death and birth. Whereas places like China have already dropped on the other side, and I think second year in a row, China's total population went down by 2 million. More people are dying than being born by that number. So if you take just that one dimension, in Kerala, you probably have a phenomenally good health and a phenomenally good education system, but not as good a job creation engine. And so you find a lot of people migrating out of Kerala either to the rest of India or to other parts of the world. And so if really you want a sustainable model where you're not a rapidly aging population, you should probably focus on ease of doing business, attracting investment, creating local jobs. I think the government is doing some of that. But that should be your priority clearly. I'm not saying whether it's being done fantastically well or only a little, but that should be the top policy priority. You take a place like Tamil Nadu, and we are still a huge engine of human capital. We produce something like 16 or 17% of all engineering graduates in the country. Of the 1 million or so in India, about 160, 170,000 coming out of Tamil Nadu. We have a decent job creation and a decent industrial base, but we are also still huge net exporters of human capital. And we have an added problem that as we have scaled the volume, we have not kept up with the fit to industry or the quality. So we should focus a lot, like our government has been doing for the last 2-3 years, on getting people job ready, even though they have a degree, or more importantly, catching people who are already at high school, who are first generation high school graduates, and educating them and their parents, informing them at least. This is what the market looks like. These are the skills that are in demand now. This is where the projected growth is. These are the careers you can hope to have. So this kind of bridging between what we have now and what would be a much better, efficient market outcome, that should be our priority. That is our priority. But if you go to places like, Gujarat, let alone Bihar or UP, in Gujarat, roughly 50% of the girls at 18 are not graduating high school. That's a serious problem, right? Those are not sustainable ways to compete in a global economy. And weighted average project productivity will be the defining factor of your future trajectory. And on that basis, I would say even a Gujarat, but certainly a UP and a Bihar and those kinds of states should focus heavily on getting every single kid born the right level of nutrition, the right level of support, getting them into elementary schools, making sure that nobody's left out, no community, no religion, women. Everybody has to get, unless you get everybody into the elementary education system today, nothing can improve your trajectory, nothing else. You get an investment, there are so many anecdotes, right? They build 10-lane highways, there's not going to be enough traffic on them for the next 10 years or 20 years. They put all this central money in. They try to attract companies. Entrepreneurs go and say, fine, they're giving me all these incentives, but A, who will I get to work in the factory? And B, who will I sell the products to? I'll still have to ship them back to the place where the consumers have the money to spend, which is the South, right? So I think the solutions that are needed to improve the leveraging of the human capital that we have are so different across different places. Even between a Kerala and Tamil Nadu, I would say there's significant difference. That's why I don't like this one-size-fits-all approach to anything. It's not rational and it's not thoughtful.
Thank you for the slightly elaborate answer. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you or ask you or pick your brains about is more to do with the fact that you were working with the DMK IT wing, which is when I was living abroad and I first learned of your work, because the online spaces, online social media spaces, especially whether it's Twitter or Facebook, used to be become these very right-wing echo chambers. Also, when anybody said anything against them, they would just go on, there would be a pile-on. They were really like a right-wing Twitter mafia. And then we saw for the first time that people were organized. The DMK IT wing was doing these very good counters. And even if it's obviously it is propaganda, but they were countering another type of propaganda, right? And I bring up this question now to you because for me it is, I think part of the problem in trying to have dialogue or discussion or even, discussing where democracy is going is that a lot of the country actually exists in these echo chambers. I mean, people are still believe what's on their WhatsApp group. How do you see that this polarization is working out? Sorry.
I'm not sure there's a not elaborate answer to that.
No, question. I honestly, sincerely thanked you. No. I sincerely thanked you for taking the time.
I appreciate. No, I'm just saying. So
I was not being sarcastic.
I'll break this again into 2 or 3 parts, right? I say, if you say there's polarization increasing, that's happening all over the world. It's not happening only in India. It's not happening only in Tamil Nadu. Every part of the world is becoming increasingly polarized, with the exception of a few countries, maybe Australia, maybe Canada, something like that. The rest of the world is just increasing polarization. Social media has been maybe in some ways a boon. It is a bane of creating echo chambers of kind of, vicious partisan kind of groupthink. And so, that's a problem everybody has. In some ways, I would say in places like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, we have less of a problem because people are relatively well educated, relatively well informed, and if they're on WhatsApp in 20 different groups. So unless all of them are spewing the same rhetoric, people are relatively well informed. Social media, or generally media, I think has pluses and minuses. The real fear for me is not social media, surprisingly. Social media is manageable risk in many ways, I think. Of course, the WhatsApp uncles and the WhatsApp, geniuses are a bane on society, but they're not that bad yet. Maybe I'm not well informed of what's happening on the grassroots. The real problem is the complete subjugation and domination of traditional media. Nobody is willing to have a debate or ask a question or say anything about the government or its policies. It's almost as if it comes from the government or from the prime minister, it is the hand of God or the diktat coming down, and therefore it must be true and everybody must say yes and it must be followed. That worries me a lot more, because a lot less educated people only get their information through the traditional media. Relatively more educated people get their information through social media. Yes, there are echo chambers. Yes, there's polarization. But that's not really the worry at this point to me, only because it's not that easy to create echo chambers in social media yet. I'll say what I mean. In places like the US, some parts of Europe, so much of your life is available in the data system that a targeting company knows what you eat, where you sleep, how often you buy this kind of grocery. And so the ability to create these kinds of sub fractional groups is very high. Almost every aspect of your life is online somewhere, whether you realize it or not. In India, it's not like that. So we don't yet have. I mean, every election, I find the capacity to target gets higher and higher, and I think it is disproportionately available to the ruling party for various reasons. But still, it's not that definable, right? So I worry a lot more about traditional media than I do about social media. Actually.
Interestingly, you brought out this. What happens with data? What happens with our data? I mean, if people are using it for targeting and election related, it's one thing, but there's a lot of fear. I mean, like, I just want to share an anecdote. I was trying to get something done with the government office, and I said, I have an Aadhaar card. Everybody says the Aadhaar is a bad thing, but I'm someone who's gone. And they said, but the Aadhaar card doesn't prove anything. What does the Aadhaar prove? The Aadhaar proves that you have an Aadhaar card. It is not proof of age. It's not proof of your date of birth. It's not proof of your residence. So it's literally useless as a document. I mean, so they're like, oh, no, no, we want your driving license, we want your transfer certificate, we want your birth certificate. So we all have, but the thing is, I mean, Aadhaar is a joke. But beyond Aadhaar, like, economists like John Dres have been pointing out how the use of Aadhaar has made many people fall out of the payment system. Or for instance, like people like Srinivas Kodali, all these digital activists saying that there's a 360-degree monitoring going on in some southern states like Telangana, which means all of our data is in one database or the other. And what happens if a law enforcement agency wants to use it? What if they want to monitor you all the time, monitor you in real time? So I mean, as somebody who is in charge of the IT department and dealing with big data, how do you look at all these fears?
Oh, it's a very it's a nuanced concept, right? Because I'll say both ways. Not even as IT minister, as finance minister, I was one of the proponents of doing some kind of means testing when my chief minister wanted to give 1,000 rupees a month to women. I said at least we should find those who are relatively wealthy, relatively not in need. And there was a big philosophical debate. What should that level be? And what is the per capita income? And it was weeks and weeks. And we got brilliant people from MIT, from Harvard. We got from JPAL. So we were very thoughtful about it. But the point of it came down to, should you target some people at least for exclusion, if not for inclusion? And as the finance minister, of course, I'm interested in the most efficient way to spend the limited resources we have. And so I believe that we should not be giving universal dole or universal, monthly payments, and we should only give it to those relatively in need. And at that time, the chief minister agreed with me, so he mentioned it in a way that actually got us a lot of political flack. But at the end of the day, we did collect, with the help of the union government, that for the first time actually shared income tax data with our state in real time. and we were able to do some kind of matching. Now, I'll give the counter example, is that what we saw in Telangana, I went there to see if, and before we got the income tax data, or, Aadhaar is a very funny thing. Aadhaar has 100 problems. Uh, its most practical use, if you want to use it that way, is to cross-reference the records from the bank, the motor vehicle department, the ration shop, the electricity bill. Its most useful function is as a cross-reference for identity, because our systems are so bad. Your name can be spelled wrong, your address can be put three different ways, your age might be slightly off, your date of birth. So in a place where there's a lot of variability in data entry and not all data is online, the greatest value of Aadhaar, just from a technical perspective, is cross-referencing. But there are many judgments about the extent to which you can do that. And it has its own problems. One of the biggest problems being that because Aadhaar was outsourced to many, many different contractors to be the original issuing agencies, there's a lot of fake data in there. Meaning, you see, if I have a database where something is slightly off, meaning my retina or my fingerprint is off, it's easily fixable. But if you have millions of records where everything else is genuine, the retina is genuine, the fingerprint is genuine, but the name and the details are fake, then that database is useless, because even were I to go and validate a card, it doesn't mean anything, because it could be validating against a fake record. I can't separate. It's like pouring water into milk. I can't take the water out again, right? It's already diluted. And so Aadhaar has own limitations, but if you can't use Aadhaar, then you got to do a lot of other things. And it turns out that, at least in Telangana, the system I saw was relatively good at triangulating across all the different sources of information and trying to find out, how much land do you own, do you have a car, are you paying income tax, how much property tax are you paying, are you a GST payer, these kinds of things. It was actually developed by a former tax officer, and there's a company there. And it did a decent job for what it was supposed to do. Now you say, can it be used for, Big Brother ends to go into? I suppose any data, anytime, if you have it, is always susceptible to that risk. But I would say, again, on the margin, as of now, we still don't have enough clarity about who is at what level in the socio-economic spectrum. And for governments like ours that are heavily in debt and continuously borrowing, having some ability to distinguish who falls at the bottom of the pyramid is actually useful, or at least who doesn't fall and therefore can be excluded is useful. It's a very fine line. On the margin, maybe still wearing my finance minister hat, I would say we have to do some of it. Otherwise, this 100% coverage thing is just not economically sustainable for most of us.
So, no, I think they have. I mean, the union government has tried to tell us Aadhaar is safe because it's behind 15 feet walls and nobody can access them. So, yeah, I'll let that fear to rest. So, one of those things that I wanted to talk to you about was that I'm going to cite the numbers here. You seem to like numbers. So, corporates have had loans waived off to the tune of 14.56 lakh crores in the last 9 or 10 years of the Modi regime. And we also read these Oxfam reports saying that the top 10% of the country owns 77% of the national wealth, or the top 1% owns 40%. And the same Oxfam report also says that the bottom 50% of the country, literally 1 in 2 Indians, all of the wealth together is only about 3%. And I want to ask this question because as somebody who's in governance and somebody who's been an MLA, opposition, ruling, what you see on the ground, this kind of reality, this kind of numbers, has it somehow led to a leftward ideological shift from you? I mean, we are in Kerala, where there's a very strong communist movement going.
No, I think sometime in 22, I delivered a memorial lecture at the Bombay Literary Festival, the Independence Day lecture, in the memory of the founder of the festival. And I said at the time, the greatest threat to democracy all over the world is high and rapidly rising inequality, right? The rich are becoming so rich and the rest are being left behind, so far behind, that the notion, in fact, I'll take 1 minute here. The core notion of a democracy as opposed to any other form of government is that it should be for the people. If it's for the people, then the fact that there is access to opportunity, that there's social mobility within a generation, that the basic quality of life in terms of drinking water and toilet facilities and roads and stuff is provided, that should be the basis on which people continue to believe that the democracy is a functional democracy, right? The equity of some outcome in some basic things. So when you start having these kinds of huge differences in outcomes, it's almost a validation that the form of government itself, that the nature of democracy itself has failed. And this is a risk that comes to all democracies. My good friend Dr. Raghuram Rajan, who advises the government of Tamil Nadu, has talked about this a lot, how though capitalism is supposed to function best in a level playing field, once there are some big winners, they figure out how to control and lobby the democratic system. And even though it's still one person, one vote, they're basically taking control of the machine of democracy. And that's happening in droves. So why I go back to all this is I'm saying it is very clear that this threat is present all over the world. And I would go one step further and say in the last 10 years, I've said this many times, from the fact that the ratio of direct taxes, and within that subset, the corporate taxes have become smaller and smaller, and the ratio of indirect taxes, which are inherently regressive, which are paid by poor and common people, is really become so big that it is unfair. So this regime for the last 10 years is increasingly a corporate, right-wing, support the richest people, oligopoly, and those kinds of crony capitalism, which is, as I think Arundhati Roy put it, crony capitalism hand in hand with fundamentalism, right? This is basically the outcome. So in that sense, I would say we are suffering from a particularly acute version of this separation. But as for the left, what I can't understand is places like Kerala, like Tamil Nadu, like South India in general, to some extent, actually Northeast also, we don't have these kinds of huge differences, right? If you just compare Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, it's the easiest because the per capita income and the size of the economy is roughly the same. But in Tamil Nadu, the Gini coefficient is like 10 or 15% lower than that in Gujarat. And the per capita consumption is much higher. We have negative fallout of that. We create more trash than anybody because everybody can buy everything. There's the other problems. But there are more MSMEs, there are more jobs, there are more factories, and there are more people with a decent wage and a decent living, even though it's the same GDP. And then you go to a place like Gujarat, and you have much greater separation, much greater strife. Then you ask yourself, if that is the state where the Gujarat model that is now taken over India comes from, what are the people there happy with that they allow this to be the repeated outcome? And is there a possibility of being a leftward shift? I don't know. I mean, at least at the country level, it doesn't make sense. The outcome should have made everybody go completely left. If anything, the right and the fascists are getting greater and greater control of the system. Right?
Well, I mean, you talked about the rightward shift happening instead of what we assume to be leftward shift, and this is quite interesting because we always assume that they're going to legislate about the big things, right? Like, okay, what they want to do with the economy, what they want to do with religion, but they started now. I mean, with what's happened in Uttarakhand, the Uniform Civil Code, for instance, and you see that the right is actually. There's an incursion into very personal space. It's their incursion into individual liberty, into individual choices. And they have said that if any two people are living together, they have to go and register or face imprisonment. And I find this as somebody who, like you regularly talk about, and you actually use these words self-determination, saying, okay, Tamil Nadu's right to decide for itself, Kerala's right to decide for itself. I mean, when states have self-determination, what about the individual people's right to, make their life choices? And how does, fascism's control of the family clash with this?
Oh, it's abhorrent, right? I mean, the notion of self-determination doesn't come from the state. It comes from the individual, right? From the Dravidian movement, when we talk about self-respect, The next thing to self-respect is self-determination at the individual level. I should be able to make the choices for me, my family, my children till they are adult, right? So only from there you say then local self-governance, because my community, my panchayat, my village will help me decide and what is right for us, and we will get to vote on it, and then you go from there. So self-determination doesn't come from the state down, it comes from the individual up. So in that sense, the notion that a state can tell you how you should live or who you should live with or whether you should register and all that is abhorrent. It's not, in my mind, it's not a civilized society. But I want to go back to your earlier question about how come we're not seeing the shift to the left, because I was just thinking about something. You see, what happens when you have this great inequality and the spread is that it builds distrust in the system. Right? That's the first thing. Before they decide whether they're going left or right and all that, the first thing is people start losing hope and they start believing that the system is broken. Once they believe the system is broken, is where great demagogues, like in the US or in Eastern Europe or in our country, can come and make it look like it is about somebody else and they are going to be the magic bullet. And people are so desperate and so angry that they'll believe almost anything, and they will allow these kinds of, I mean, it won't last forever, and nothing lasts forever. Some point it self-corrects. But there's the scope for demagoguery and the scope for kind of strongman, fantasism of I will make the world better is very ripe when you have this kind of disgruntlement or continuous separation, right? And then I remember reading something about this or listening to a podcast in the US where they said, in addition to the fact that the bulk are staying down and the few are increasing, what has driven a lot of the surge of right-wing kind of fascist movements in the US is that the face of society is changing. It used to be white country. I mean, I lived there from 87 to 2007, right? Whites were clearly the majority. And I think we are either at the point or we passed the point where they're less than 50% of the population. There's now other people there. And so a lot of the old kind of, small town, less exposed people.
Anti-immigrant rhetoric.
Yeah, no, and it started with this, not only am I getting poorer, but this is not the country that I was born into anymore. My country is being changed beyond what I would have desired or liked. And therefore, the machine must be corrupt. The system must be rotten. Therefore, even anarchy is better than this. So, that's the ripeness. Here, I don't think the country has changed that much, but possibly religion has been used as a lever to support the demagoguery and this disparity. Ironically, it's the same people doing the demagoguery who are actually increasing the disparity. But they're still able to get away with it, which is some kind of political magic, right?
No, thank you for talking about attitudes and how I read something in FT recently. They went and interviewed a lot of young men and women on their political views and trying to see who is progressive. And they say that the difference is not so much by age. They say the difference is very stark because we are having like very different outcomes for women. Women are increasingly more progressive across all ages, and men, for instance, are the younger men are far more like regressive or conservative or taking very backward ideological positions. And this survey was done across the world, so they did it in Korea, they did it in the UK, US, and possibly parts of Asia as well. So I mean, and I wanted to bring this up, in terms of this different outcomes, because you talked about Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. What is the difference? And I was thinking that, when they introduced free bus rides for women, or they start giving this 1,000 rupees entitlement scheme, there's a certain way in which Tamil women have, been so integral to the political mainstream. I mean, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of imagination, in terms of articulation. I remember Periyar in 1938 getting arrested for the Hanti in the agitation, saying, the women's place in the struggle is no less than a man's place. If the men are not coming to the struggle, you're going to come to the struggle, they're going to follow. And do you think this gender divide plays across this country in terms of who remains backward and who doesn't?
No, I think, I'm a bit startled by the statistic you told me that across the world, whether it's Korea or US, or I'd be fascinated to see what it said about Scandinavia or Australia or Singapore, but I'll leave that for now because I don't quite contemplate it. I can't understand it. But what I do understand, I would say certainly one of the great advantages of certainly Kerala and Tamil Nadu, possibly other southern states, is the much greater participation of women in every aspect of society, from education, employment, entrepreneurship, all of it. And you may have seen the recent New York Times article, which I think got a couple of stats wrong. But the overall point being that a state that is 5 or 6% of the population has something like 43% of the women working in, like, what do you say, EPF, ESI paying manufacturing jobs, right? That's a huge statistic. Now, of course, it says many things. It says that the women are empowered. It says they're educated, they're capable of coming to the workforce. It also says we're able to attract enough industry and create an environment where, because if it was just the capability, Kerala is probably further than Tamil Nadu, but they're not getting that kind of investment into the manufacturing. So, it's a balance of many things, but 100%, it has to be the extent to which women are in the formal economy and given equal rights or equal access as the precursor to being in the formal economy. That must be a driver of a lot of outcomes. It's just math, right? If 50% of the population is not given access, then how can you compete with somebody where 100% of the population has access? It's just not in the realm of possibility, right?
Yeah. Earlier, you spoke about demagogues and people who can go around saying what they want to say and finding, in Western countries, finding the immigrant or, black or brown people as problematic. But here we have been trying, what I have increasingly seen is, they take a very academic term like decolonization, strip it of its roots. And I think 2 days ago or 3 days ago, somebody I don't want to name said that caste is a Western concept. Uh, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where to start because I also don't want to name him, but that particular individual has made a career of this kind of fantasy, which apparently sells to some subsection of the ill informed or uninformed. Started out with all kinds of falsehoods about how temples in Tamil Nadu were nationalized first. I'll give him one credit. He's consistent in his logic. He also criticizes Mr. Modi's Gujarat government for nationalizing temples 100 years after the Dravidian parties did it. But, this kind of, I don't know, there's a whole micro economy of people who are going around making a living and fame and career out of ever more fantastic notions, that the rocket was written up about in the Vedas and supercomputers existed in,
You doubt those ideas?
no, no, so I'm saying, we live in this strange age, right, where the polarization has happened enough, or there's enough of a living to be made by coming up with these fantasies to some kind of lumpen element. So, I mean, can't begrudge anybody a career. If that's the career, I mean, there are con men, there are charlatans, there are, crooks, there are fantasists. Let them make a career. I can't get vexed about it.
Coming back to this question of caste, I was also very keen to know. We talked about data. I mean, the census would give us a lot of data, right? Like, especially for as a state, like for you to.
No, I gave an interview. I
Yeah.
think it was part of an article that was published last Sunday in Bangalore in the Deccan Herald. And they asked me, what is the loss of having not having the census? And I said, it's the loss of everything, right? Like all equations, either the numerator or the denominator requires me to know how many people of what type, of what age, of what community, of what gender, without having some measure of where the population is and what the relative location variances are. It's very hard to do policy making in the dark. In fact, I went one step further. I said in a country like India, doing a census once in 10 years itself is an abject failure. We should do a census every 3 or 5 years like other countries do. And in fact, it doesn't require that many resources. We update the electoral rolls every 6 months. How hard can it be to do a census? After all, you're deploying. I mean, it's not like the central government uses 10 million of its own workers, right? It deploys the local body employees or officers, so forth. So I think it's extraordinarily irresponsible and debilitating in policy making, irresponsible of the government and debilitating in policy making to not have census data after 2011. We're using 13-year-old data. There's no other approximation. I mean, of course, you can make them based on other things. And we should not just do a census every 10 years. We should do it every 3 years, ideally, if not every 5 years. And only, so then the next question arises, why would you not do the census? What's the upside to not doing the census? I mean, if I say,
the
as a policy,
data, they don't want
no, it's not just the caste data, right? Data itself is anathema to people who are running a propaganda machine. So, I said that as the last point, but other people quoted in that article said it as the first point, that if you are running a smoke and mirrors machine, the last thing you want is real information. So you suppress the data and then you run the smoke and mirrors on top of that, right?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm now going to, my questions come to an end. The floor is open for questions. So we have 15 minutes of questions from the audience. There's a mic around. Yeah, sure.
Hi. Yeah, when we talk about Reimagine India, what's the role of education and also the book that Rahuram Rajan published recently? There are like very stark figures, like 35% of kids are having nutritional deficiencies and stunted growth. So where is India going to be developed in 2047 with these figures?
You're exactly right. We have a small window of opportunity. It's very small. Because the problem started, at least it started with demonetization, where there were lots of people without basic access to, fruits, vegetables, milk, etc. And lots of young children ended up with bad outcomes. I can see that, though it pains me. In my constituency, I go around and keep checking every few months because there are still cases that we can see. We pride ourselves on being a developed state. We say we have $4,000, US per capita income. We should not even have one case of such things. But the system is such that we have developed it slightly. But if it's slight problem in Tamil Nadu, imagine what the problem is in the really populous states, which are also the poorest states. So I genuinely believe, by coincidence, Raghu serves on our board of advisors for the state, and I had happened to run into both Rohit and Raghu when I was at Chicago to give a lecture. And I couldn't agree more with the premise that unless you fix this generation, unless you go and ensure the nutrition and education of the 0 to 5-year-olds now, it doesn't matter what else you do. It simply doesn't matter what else you do. You will pay a significant retardant effect at the very least, or much worse when you're 15 years from now, right? Because and this is not new concept, right? When I studied development economics long ago, somebody said to me, it stuck with me since then, my professor, he said, if you're in a developing economy, the best thing you can do with every extra dollar that you have to spend, every extra dollar, the best thing you can do is invest it in elementary education and nutrition. Because a generation from now, you'll get the benefit. The real problem in democracies is that it'll take me 15 years to see the benefit. Before that, I got to stand for 3 or 4 elections, right? And I can't keep saying, wait for that generation to come, wait for everybody wants a shortcut. So it's much easier to go and do something in the meantime to make it like a populist something than to invest in this. But at least places like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, we're on the right track. I don't see anywhere in the union's policies where they talk about all these big things. They say make in India, create India, digital India, Achedin, Amrit Kal. They say all kinds of things. Nowhere have they said our goal is to get 100% elementary education and adequate nutrition. That is the single objective that has to be number one. You can't do that, you can't do anything else. It doesn't matter how many slogans you put, you will never succeed.
So very good evening. So it's a wonder to say that democracy has sustained in India for 75 years, and the freedom of expression can be seen only in the preamble. As far as writers are concerned, freedom of expression is stringently curbed under the purview of the post-truth politics. And the civic nationalism enshrined by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar is being falsified into different diverse ways of nationalism, even ethno-religious nationalism is there. How would you look at this particular opposed to politics, and how will it exemplify or illustrate this particular statement?
Look, I think if you have low or degrading education and you have high or rising inequality, you have created fertile ground for this kind of adverse political uh, environment, right? And somebody or the other is going to exploit it, and they're going to probably lever it up to the max they can. So I agree with you that in many senses, and it's not me. I mean, there's public rankings all over the world. I was at actually a lecture recently, and the dinner, it was of the kind of people who I would say 95% of them are likely to be. I don't know, they're not wearing their identities on their lapels, but they're likely to be RSS, BJP type people. They were lamenting the fact that this lecture was the Nani Palkhiwala lecture, right? And Nani Palkhiwala memorial lecture. It was, he apparently, I was not in the country at the time, he was so famous that he would run a budget related lecture that was more popular than people listening to the budget itself, right? And then so there was a huge debate, and and they were lamenting the fact, because it was the Palkhiwala Memorial Foundation, that where has that space in the country gone? Where is that, desire for engaged debate? It can have 100 different views, but the space for that debate itself seems to be suppressed. Nobody can say anything. If you say something slightly off with the budget, you say, no, you're anti-national. You're some Naxalite, something. So we have reached a very dark place in that sense where, and I posted this on social media. I said, I go to so many opening ceremonies, so many inaugurations, so many, events, and we always start with lighting the lamp. I happen to be a Hindu, but I suppose part of the culture everywhere, we start with lighting the lamp, because the notion of light, of illumination, of knowledge, of truth is so core to our long history and traditional culture. And here we have the world getting rapidly darker, 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 at least in India. No information, no data, no survey, no debate, no discussion. Whatever is given from above is taken as the word of God and must be followed. This is a very depressing place. It's not going to lead to good outcomes, in my opinion.
Sir here. Good evening, sir. So my question is, you mentioned about the 1,000 rupees entitlement scheme to household ladies, right? So my question is, how can you get a return out of it? Household chores are not properly rewarded, right? So how can technology and the government involve itself so that whatever the activities that women are doing at home, you can mainstream it, you can create a business model out of it, and it will get an earning for themselves out of this, and get an earning for the government through taxes, through the products that they produce, like the self-help groups.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot with self-help groups, and I do it in my constituency more than others. I mean, I'm happy to talk to you. Like, I actually have my own databases. I run my own training programs. We have many, many more self-help groups than when I became an MLA. After I became minister, I doubled up on it. So, relative to most parts of the country, we do a lot with self-help groups, and we do a lot of training, execution, etc. I do more than most as an MLA. But this particular payment was a campaign promise my chief minister made, and he wanted the promise fulfilled, so we worked towards fulfilling that promise. This is not intended to be a multiplier effect or a leverage. It was more a social justice thing, because a lot of women were not getting access to the liquidity and so forth. But I mean, they are not mutually exclusive. We can do both. I'm not sure maybe we could have tied it better, but we are where we are. We are not neglecting the self-help groups and getting the women into productive either entrepreneurship or work. We do that also, and we do it relatively well compared to most places. But this was something my chief minister had a commitment, and we all executed what he said we should execute. It would have been easier for me personally as the former finance minister if the number was more restricted to the truly bottom of the pyramid. But again, I'm just a minister. The chief minister sets the tone, and we did what he wanted done. Right? So.
Oh, so are we out of time?
Just one question.
No, We
Just
still
one
have a
question.
couple of minutes. Yeah, I just wanted to answer this. I mean, it's a question to the minister. I don't want to step on his area, but part of the reason why a lot of feminists or women would welcome this move outside of you cannot always tell women what to do. Like you give them money. Okay, this is what you do. Part of it is to recognize. And this is a movement that goes from the 60s. Feminists around the world have been asking wages for housework. That most of the work that they do doesn't get paid. I mean, most of the labor, in fact, like you give birth to two children, nobody is paying you for giving birth, right? So, I mean, all of the work of social reproduction, all of the work of labor in your home. I mean, none of this gets recognized in any way, and you don't get any access to cash. So, I think giving this money to women in a way, like kind of they call it entitlement scheme, and I think it respects them. So to I mean, as possibly sir suggested, we could think ahead, but the core of it should not be to operate on just the idea of profit. So and also to
I
trust
think
women.
the word they use for it is urimai togai, which is that it's your right. So the CM had a long-standing, commitment to doing this. So we did it the way he wanted to do it.
Sir,
So yes, sir.
the question which I am going to ask now was asked to Mr. Parakala Prabhakar. He didn't answer it. So I would like to know, what is your opinion and assessment of Mrs. Nirmala, Finance Minister?
So,
Look, I think it's a professional courtesy that we should not comment on each other. I will say one thing which you will not probably expect me to say, that as long as I was the finance minister of Tamil Nadu, every single time, in fact, even once after, every single time I asked for an appointment, I got an appointment. Every single time I gave her some reasonable request, she considered it. To the extent possible, she did what she could. Many things didn't get done, but that's politics and that's the government. So I personally, I always found her courteous, respectful, considerate, and I reciprocated to the best I could. So, different people have different opinions. Outcome-wise or professionalism-wise, I don't want to comment on others. I'm not qualified to do that. I've only done my job. I don't know how much more complex it is to do the job of Government of India's finance minister. So I won't get into that.
thank you, thank you, sir, for being very magnanimous with your appraisal of people. You even said CM Modi was.
Yeah, as I say, one of the greatest champions of federalism of all time was Chief Minister Modi, and one of the loudest voices. Were I to start playing back his video clips now of all the questions he asked, you would find me docile by
mild.
comparison. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we are coming to an end.